So one of my favorite ways to budget is what's called zero-based budgeting, or giving every dollar an assignment. But this is not how most people do their budget. And if you want to know what 98% of Americans are doing wrong when it comes to budgeting, well, here it is. And actually, if you don't have savings, you are probably following along with the majority of Americans in this example. Most people will take their income, they'll pay all their fixed expenses like rent, mortgage, car payments, utilities, etc. Then they'll set aside a small amount for savings if they even remember. And then they lines take whatever money is left over at the end of the month and spend it on whatever they want. And there is nothing inherently wrong with this method. I mean, if you have extra money at the end of the month, why not spend it? And you should. Which is why this method is also known as the pay yourself first method. But here's where most people mess up. Most people don't save because they don't have any money left at the end of the month. They don't have any leftover money at the end of the month because they spent all of it. And they spent all of it on things that they didn't really need or couldn't afford, or both. And so instead of saving for the things that they want, they just go into debt, and then they have to work the next month to pay off that debt. And before you know it, they're in a cycle of spending, paying down the debt, working, spending, paying down the debt, working. I mean, if you're making $4,000 a month, but you're spending $4,200 a month, sure, maybe you can get away with this for a little while, but eventually you're going to have to pay down that debt. And that's fine if you can afford to do so, but most people cannot. So here's where the other 2% of people who have money saved come in. They've been able to save money because they follow the 20% rule when it comes to their finances, which means that whenever they purchase something, they add 20% onto the price tag of that item, and then they put that money into savings. Let's say that you want to buy a new TV that costs $700. You would add another $140 on top of that to be able to cover the cost of it. So now instead of spending $700 on a TV, you spent $840. And if you do this with everything you buy, well, guess what happens? You now have $140 in your bank account, and that goes towards your savings. Now let's say that you have a few $100s sitting in your bank account right now. Well, with this method, you could use all of that towards buying something that you want. But with the 20% rule, you would have to be able to come up with an additional 20% on top of that to be able to cover the cost. So, if you wanted to buy a $400 item, you would have to have $480 ready to spend. And if you didn't have that money available, you wouldn't be able to buy it because it's just too much money, and that sounds counterintuitive. Why would you want to be forced to save more money than you actually have? Well, here's why. When you add 20% to the cost of things, you are now building in a cushion for those surprise expenses that inevitably pop up throughout the month, because here's what happens. When something unexpected comes along, like a car repair bill or a medical bill, most people will have to borrow money from somewhere to be able to cover these costs. But if you had a cushion built into your budget, you wouldn't have to. You would already have that money saved and ready to go. And by having this cushion, you're able to avoid going into debt and paying interest on that debt. And it also gives you peace of mind knowing that you don't have to worry about coming up with the money for these unexpected expenses. You've already done that. You've already taken care of that. And you might be thinking, why 20%? Why not 10% or 30%? Well, 20% is a good middle ground between saving too much and not saving enough. If you save too much, well, you won't be able to buy the things that you want, and if you don't save enough, well, you'll never have any money for the unexpected expenses. And yes, I know that some things like insurance premiums are usually quoted in percentages. However, for the purposes of this video, I was referring to the general rule of thumb of saving an additional 20% on top of the cost of something. So let me give you an example of someone who implemented the 20% rule. Let's say that we have two people who each make $4,000 a month. The only difference between them is that one person saves 20% of their money and the other person doesn't. So the first person spends 80% of their money and saves 20% of their money. That means that they have $800 a month to spend. The second person spends 100% of their money. They don't save anything. Well, at the end of the first person's first year, they would have saved $12,000. At the end of the second person's first year, they would have saved nothing. Now, let's throw in a wrench. Let us say that each of these people has a $2,000 car repair bill come up during the second year. The first person, because they had savings, were able to cover this expense without having to borrow any money. The second person, however, had to borrow this money, let's say at a 6% interest rate, and now they owe $2,120. At the end of the second year, the first person would have saved $24,000, whereas the second person would have saved nothing, and still owe that $2,120. And this is just one example. There are countless others out there. And look, I am aware that if you're watching this channel, you're probably not spending 20% of your money on avocado toast, although that's a very real concern. But that's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about here is being able to cover those unexpected expenses that come up, because let's face it, we all have them, and the last thing that you want to do is to have to borrow money to be able to cover them, because now you're repaying interest on that loan, and that is money that you don't have to spend. And if you think that this is a bad idea, just consider what Dave Ramsey says on the matter. He says to increase the price of everything by 20%. And he also suggests building an emergency fund with 3 to 6 months' worth of expenses. So, if you're making $4,000 a month, that means that you want to have between $12,000 and $24,000 in your emergency fund. So, if you're making $4,000 a month, that means that you want to be spending $800 on things and saving $200 a month. So, you can see that this is a pretty common practice and suggestion across the board. It's not just me saying this. Some of the biggest financial experts out there agree with it. So, if you're not currently doing this, consider implementing the 20% rule and just try it out for a month. Just see what it's like and how it works. I guarantee that you won't regret it. Now, if you want to learn more about the 20% rule, I highly recommend checking out this video. Next, I'll see you there.